So what is Raspberry Pi? So Raspberry Pi is the name of a series of single board computers made by Raspberry Pi Foundation. It's capable of doing everything you would expect a desktop computer to do, from browsing the internet and playing high definition videos to making spreadsheets, word processing, and playing games. The Raspberry Pi was actually launched in the year 2012, and there has been several iterations and variations released since then. The original Pi, which was released in 2007, was 700 MHz CPU speed and it had just 256 MB RAM. But the latest one, the most recent one, is the Raspberry Pi 4, released in 2020, has a CPU of 1.5 GHz CPU and a RAM of 8 GB. And the Raspberry Pi is a very cheap computer that runs Linux, and it also provides lots of GPIO options. GPIO stands for General Purpose Input Output. And all over the world, the people use Raspberry Pi to learn programming skills and lots of hardware projects like home automations, image recognition, etc. And we'll be talking about some of these projects. And now that we are here, I can show you some of the parts. This is a small diagram of Raspberry Pi. It's almost like a credit card size. Its high length is like 5.5 centimeter and 9 centimeter, and it comes with lots of external connectable ports like Ethernet, and you have this Ethernet here, and you have four USB port option as well. These ports actually help you connect keyboards or a Wi-Fi adapter or external memory RAM. We can connect all those using the USB port. And it also comes with the audio jack. So basically, if you want to do any audio based projects, this is a very good option. And as you can see here, this is a camera module. So you won't be able to, I would say, let me take back the word. You will be able to connect cameras with the USB option, but there are cameras which you can connect to the camera module in the Raspberry Pi. This actually helps you in lots of other functionalities while doing the programming. And here is the HDMI port. And if you want to connect your external monitor, this is a very good option. And most of the time, people like to use it without an external monitor, and we'll talk about that later on. And it also comes with a micro USB option for power connection. And this is the slot where you can see the there is an option to upload the software which is needed for Raspberry Pi. So it's usually loaded into a small micro SD card and it's inserted here, which actually boots up the Raspberry Pi. The main key part of Raspberry Pi, to be honest, is the GPIO. GPIO stands for General Purpose Input Output Pins, and basically they have this electric signal through which they are able to connect external sensors and manipulate them. Like it could be a temperature sensor, it could be a humidifier sensor, or it could be a servo motors. So like that, you can connect lots of sensors and make lots of projects with that. Okay, so this is a smaller version of Raspberry Pi. They call it as Raspberry Pi Zero actually. So they cost almost $5, and the Pi Zero also comes with something called. So this is a another variation of Raspberry Pi. They call it as Raspberry Pi Zero. So Raspberry Pi Zero actually is a smaller version of Raspberry Pi with less compute power and less input output options, but the GPIO pin remains the same. So as you can see, let me just go back and pull my pen. So these are the GPIOs which we could use to control the external sensors. Unfortunately, they don't come with a pin solder, so one needs to solder it by themselves, and it's not pretty hard to solder the pins to the GPIO options. And having said that, Raspberry Pi Zero has two options, one with the Wi-Fi, one without the Wi-Fi. The one with the Wi-Fi has is like 10 $10, and the one without the Wi-Fi is comes to around $5. And it also comes with a one micro USB power port option. At the same time, it has a mini HDMI, and you have to convert into an HDMI to connect to external monitor. And this also comes with a micro SD card through which we load the operating system. And I would say like what you can do with Raspberry Pi, the bigger version, you can pretty much you can do the same thing with Raspberry Pi Zero version as well. And these are very small. These are like 6.4 centimeters and 2.5 centimeters. And coming back to the connecting to monitor, right? I mean, there, as I said before, there are different ways you can connect Raspberry Pi. One is we call it as connecting to TV monitor, wherein you can use your HDMI push to connect to the TV monitor and have a keyboard connected to the USB options available in Raspberry Pi, and connect the Ethernet to the home router. That's one option. Okay, and this is some people they use try to use this. Well, this is not my favorite way of doing it because it just requires more external components. I try to use something called a headless connection. Okay, so what it means is you don't need to have a monitor. Okay, you can use your personal laptop. So this if this is your personal laptop, you can just connect to this laptop to this Raspberry Pi through the router. And I'm going to do a lab on this actually, wherein I'm going to show you making connection headless way to the Raspberry Pi. So the Ethernet actually connects to your router, and your computer connects to the router, and you should be able to get the Raspberry Pi IP address and directly connect from your laptop. Also, there is an option through which you can directly connect using Ethernet cable to the Ethernet port of Raspberry Pi to the Ethernet port of your laptop, so that it's like a two-way connection between Raspberry Pi and laptop. Even that option is also possible, and both options works actually. One with the internet, one without the internet option. Both looks easy, but if you want to go with monitor options, then it comes with lots of pain, especially connecting the monitor, and you need extra component. It just doesn't make sense. Okay, and let me just talk about the history of Raspberry Pi. Who was the inventor of Raspberry Pi? It's nothing but Eben Upton. So he's the genius behind Raspberry Pi. And if you can see this, this is the first version of Raspberry Pi. Can you believe how it has been improvised since then? So this is actually a working computer. And if you go and Google on YouTube for Eben Upton, you should be able to look at his interview wherein he shows off this particular small board, which is a working computer. It's an amazing genius. So actually, once the Raspberry Pi was created, a Raspberry Pi Foundation was created in 2009, and they made Eben Upton as a CEO. And you might be wondering why Raspberry Pi as the name. So, as you can see, there are lots of companies with the fruit name like Apple. Okay, so similarly, going with the same line, they decided to name this board as a Raspberry. And why Pi? Because one of the common languages which you find in Raspberry Pi is Python. Okay, so they decided to go with Pi. So that's how the Raspberry Pi came into picture, and it's backed by University of Cambridge Computer Laboratory and tech from Broadcom. That's the reason it's become so famous. And right now there are like millions of schools which are using this computer in a large manner to get the exposure of students to the computer. And it also comes with the Scratch program, which is very kid friendly. Okay, so that's kind of it makes it easy for kids to learn programming on Raspberry Pi because it's more like a drag and drop. Okay, coming back to the features. So one of the main features is it's a very low cost. Okay, as I said before, Raspberry Pi Zero starts with $5, and the Raspberry Pi 4 costs almost $40 if you want to go with the lower RAM. Of course, if you want to go with the higher RAM, it goes to $75, but still the price is relatively less compared to what the Raspberry Pi can perform. And it's credit card size and fanless. Yes, it doesn't make sound and instantly starts up. The booting time is in terms of seconds actually, and it's very easy to program. And you have to say it's Python is a universal language which is used in Raspberry Pi, but you should be able to program in any language like C sharp, like C++, C, JavaScript, many languages. And it consumes very less voltage, okay? And it's not like a computer which if you run for so many hours, it consumes so much power, right? So unlike that, Raspberry Pi, you can easily use it for a long running projects. And what was the actual motivation behind releasing the Raspberry Pi? Okay, so Eben Upton, as I said, is the founder of Raspberry Pi. He wanted to come out with a smaller version of computer so that it's easy for students to have access to the computer. That's what motivated them to come come out with this particular um, Raspberry Pi computer, and they wanted to make sure that every kid has an easy access to computer science skills. That's what the Sketch programming is, the number of first programming language which was introduced with Raspberry Pi. And you also saw lots of decline in students for computer science, because of which he decided to have a computer through which it's easy for students to get into computer science. And coming to technology, I just want to show you something here. So here is a website which talks about the comparisons of different Raspberry Pis. Okay, so the first version was Raspberry Pi B. Okay, and now we have Raspberry Pi 4GB. This is a great website if you want to do the comparisons of different Raspberry Pi boards. As I told you before, the very first version was 100 megahertz, and look at this, 1.5 gigahertz. That's a lot. And initially they had a GPIO pins of 26. Okay, eventually they made it 40 pins, so which helps you connect more external devices. And I can go after each line and explain you, but I think you got the point. Feel free to get on this website and compare yourself on different Raspberry Pi boards out there. And coming back to slides again, Raspberry Pi can run two kinds of operating system. One is the Raspbian. So Raspbian is one of the variations of Linux actually. So uh, right now there is something called Raspbian Buster. That's the most recent Raspbian version, and we can also install Windows 10. Okay, although it's not so famous, but there are lots of people out there, hobbyists, who are using Windows 10 to load into Raspberry Pi and do their programming. And Windows 10, when I say Windows 10, it's not the version which you load on your laptop, because that's more of a heavier version. Microsoft has released a lighter version of Windows 10. Okay, so that's the one which we could use. But all the projects which I'm going to talk in this course will be using Raspbian, and it's also very easy to set up the Raspbian onto Raspberry Pi. With that said, I think we are good with the first module. Let's meet again in the next module.